Good. Thank you all so much for coming out to the fourth of our Q&As for our Spring Curious Minds series presented by Hollywood Suite. And over the next 2 hours, we're going to be checking in with each of our 4 lecturers who are going to be answering the terrific questions that you sent us this week in response to their fourth lectures in Q&As. If you'd are planning to stick around 11 and 11:30, make sure at those times. But in the meantime, as always, delighted to kick off our Friday with the one and only Dr. Mike Daley, who delivered a fascinating lecture this week, taking us into the early heyday of the folk revival. He discussed fascinating figures like Ian and Sylvia, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and the one and only Bob Dylan. It is a great pleasure and I'd like to ask you all to join me in giving him your warmest curious.
Some good questions to take on this morning, so I'm just going to get right to it. Phil writes, in the late 50s, I owned an LP by Oscar Brand, Body Songs and Backroom Ballads. Some of the lyrics still run through my head from time to time. Think humoresque. Are these types of songs examples of the oral transmission and transmutation of old ballads, or is there a separate category for them? So I believe Oscar Brand did 4 volumes of that Body Songs and Backroom Ballads. And they were very popular apparently with college students. It was these were songs that had subject matter and lyrics that were definitely not going to be acceptable in a commercial realm, and so there was a sort of forbidden or underground quality to these songs. On a similar note, I've had a songbook for a number of years that was compiled by Jerry Silverman, who's another folk revival important person, and it's called Dirty Songs, and it's a lot of these same songs. And so these are songs that have circulated in oral tradition for a long time, but have not been published or recorded for obvious reasons, because of the subject matter, which is usually sexual or something else. And so my understanding with the Oscar Brand songs is that these were songs that he had picked up, that he had learned, and in some cases he filled in lyrics that he couldn't remember. He added to them, he changed them. In a couple of cases he actually censored them and made them less filthy than they actually were. Stay still. And so for various reasons they get changed to adapt to current needs. But that is kind of there's an underground history here with these folk songs, is that there are a lot of these songs sort of I mean, it's commercially it's a subgenre, but of course in oral tradition anything goes. So it's not subject to those same types of censorship and standards. But of course, when Oscar Brand recorded them, he felt that it was expedient to chop them down a little bit and make them more acceptable. Laura writes, what was traditionally seen as rural music was being adapted and embraced by urban audiences. Was there a tension there? Yes, absolutely. There were all kinds of oppositions at play. The fact that the folk, and in New York particularly, being the center of the entertainment business in the United States, this was where the money was being made, where the record companies were, where a lot of the network radio companies were, especially in the 1940s. So this was, if you were it was the New York-based musicians who were really profiting from these songs, many of which they were drawing from southern rural sources. And in the whole commercial versus traditional versus topical three-way debate in the folk revival, you know, you've got these traditionalists, you've got these northern, urban, college educated, middle class musicians who are affecting southern accents and listening to recordings of southern string bands as if they are holy writ and copying them, and then taking that act out on the road and making money playing in clubs and selling records to other northerners. And so there was a definite co-optation there. So there was tension on that side. But the commercial argument is kind of a separate argument, because the commercial musicians actually drained out the general audience. So you look at, say, the Kingston Trio. The Kingston Trio are adapting these songs, and they're, you know, straightening them out. And Peter, Paul, and Mary, same thing. And so that where the traditionalists are doing, there's a bit of a costuming, or what the kids refer to as cosplay today, where you're sort of dressing up in the garb of the person that you're trying to imitate. And there's a little bit, it resonates with minstrel of black culture. I think of a northern urban folk musician putting on a southern twang and you know, doing these songs talking about southern issues and sort of wearing the garb of this culture. There's a minstrel aspect to it. To me, I think, yes, I think there definitely was a tension there, and that but I would say that the commercial debate, non-commercial or traditional versus commercial, or topical versus commercial, I feel like it was more to do with matters of style, musical style, that were the source of the tension between the rural and urban. You know, in the rural context, you know, a lot of people had moved on to newer commercial forms like country music, and they were not preserving this music. And so you've got these northern folk revivalists who are taking this music, and they feel that they're saving it from its own people, right? Because they're preserving it, whereas the people where the music actually had circulated have sort of thrown it aside. And this is often a thing that is 1920s and 1930s for obvious reasons, and have moved on to new types of music. So yeah, it's a big subject. Karen writes, you mentioned the Newport Jazz Festival in this week's lecture. How important was festival culture to the folk revival, and what were the most important festivals? Well, folk festivals, of course, go way back. They go back to 1928 in both the United States and Canada. We talked about the Marius Barbeau folk song and handicraft festival in Quebec City in 1928, as well as the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival in Asheville, North Carolina, spearheaded by Bascom Lamar Lunsford. And the festivals really ramp up in the 50s. The Berkeley Folk Festival is an important one, beginning in 58 and ending in 70. Newport starts in 59 in Ontario. And were these festivals important? Absolutely. They, for the three-way debate between the traditionalists, the commercial people, and the topical people. Sometimes that mixes. So because the festival tries to represent folk music, and folk music is never one thing, it's always going to be a contentious space that depending on who's the artistic director, you might go in different directions with that. So yeah, absolutely, they're important. They are star-making vehicles for performers. Certainly the Newport Festival very quickly became an important place for new musicians to get heard and to get noticed and to get written about. I'm thinking of Joan Baez in particular. Bob Dylan really benefited from his final lecture. The folk festivals are, in a way, they're kind of the strongest vestige of the folk revival today, that folk festivals have survived, where folk venues have have not, where some of the smaller, more grassroots or local representations of live folk music, as well as folk music on record, have really shrunk. The folk festivals are going strong because they are they're a solid economic model. Okay. See a link between folk music and any popular political movements in our country, comparable to its role in the labor and civil rights movements in the US. Well, as far as homegrown Canadian folk songs, we've been strongest in what we could call occupational songs. That is, songs that talk about various types of work, the difficulty of that type of work, occasionally the unfairness of the bosses or of the system. But there has been use of folk songs for the purposes of protest at certain points, especially in the labor movement in Canada. The Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, it was a big example of this, where you saw a lot of songs where you have labor organizations coming in. They are bringing the songs from the Little Red Songbook, from the Wobblies and so on. And so the songs that are being used in the American labor union context are also being used in Canada. The miners' strike in Estevan, Saskatchewan in 1931 was also another site where we see folk songs being written and altered to suit the immediate context. And I found a great article about this, Dan, if you want to look into it further. If you have a Toronto Library account, just go on to the library website and type into the search JSTOR, JSTOR. This is a repository of academic papers, and look up a paper by Edith, Labor and Industrial Protest Songs in Canada. And it's an excellent survey by our preeminent folklorist, Edith Folk. So, Anna writes, this may be us and would have created national awareness with their performances and large record sales. In your opinion, do you think their songs and efforts created any positive change, political or social? It seems our world is not any better now. The topical songs, so say if we talk about the 1960s and all of these topical songs, Phil Oakes and Bob Dylan and so on, my sense is that these songs more reinforced the beliefs of listeners than changed minds. I don't know that Bob Dylan convinced anybody of anything, and I think that's a product of what happens when you draw a traditional practice like folk music into the capitalist system of commodification. Capitalism has a way of imposing its shape and its logic on everything that it co-ops. And so I think that that has taken away a lot of the effectiveness of folk music, of its impact. I think that most people, they treated folk music during the folk revival as entertainment, and yeah, that's my sense. My sense is that it didn't move the needle very much. That it made a lot, that these songs see that they actually, I think it was more theme music for movements that were already underway than actual catalysts. Okay. Derek writes, Mike, if you could go back in time and listen to any musicians from the era interest in Yorkville, and I wasn't there, I would want to go back to some of these clubs in Yorkville. I would want to go to the Village Corner, spend an evening in the Village Corner, hearing Ian and Sylvia, or or actually some of these people that never recorded. I would love to hear, because so many of these musicians that played in these places never recorded. I'd love to hear what they sounded like. I'd love to hear Jim McCarthy sing. I don't have anything by him. The only recordings by him that I'm aware of are with the Dirty Shames and folk material. I would love to have heard Greg Curtis at the Concerto in 1955. I mean, that's that time. But I have had a research breakthrough with my white whale, and that is Greg Curtis, who I knew nothing about. I have found his twin brother, and he's around, so I'm hoping to interview him over the phone next week. I'm extremely excited. Okay, so we are at time, and there's
in future Mike Daley sessions here at Cure Minds, I hope. But as always, Mike, such a pleasure, and certainly with all the political turmoil in the world right now, it's you've left us with a lot to reflect on as we head into the weekend about the intersection of popular culture and politics, and about what great musicians can give us in these times, and then the limits of what they can offer. Yeah. Before I let you go, we have a real barn burner for our audience members on Monday, when we'll be posting your 5th lecture, where we're really hitting the sort of the meat of this series. We've got Dylan going electric. We've got cameos from Lightfoot and Neil Young and others. Things are heating up. Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, it's the collision of folk and rock music is a pretty exciting time, but in a way, it's also the death of the revival as we know it. Rock really does draw in folk and takes a lot of its mojo away and makes it its own.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, something for us to look forward to. In the meantime, as always, Mike, a huge thank you. Have a wonderful weekend. And to all of you at home, thank you for checking in. Please join us next week, and we'll see you next week.